Well, hello again, beloved students. I remain Mr. Laskowski, your teacher and the host of this ongoing series, AP United States History, and you. Today, we'll pick up the narrative of American history at the exact spot on the road to revolution where we left off, 1768, and the circular letter. As we mosey down this road, please remember to take great notes on everything you see here. Some of it is heroic, much of it is not. All of it is important. So let's get right to it, shall we? When we last left our heroes, colonists had responded to the Townshend duties with protests, complaints, and generalized discontent. Sam Adams, whose head seems here to have been poorly photoshopped onto the body in this painting, he went so far as to write the circular letter which urged the colonies to stay in touch with each other so that they could coordinate their responses to whatever that next terrible thing might happen in one of the colonies. And this led, eventually, to the creation of the Committees of Correspondence. But first, we had to just wait and see what that next terrible thing was going to be. Well, if you've ever seen a game at Fenway Park, or just met a Boston Red Sox fan, you probably understand why many of the loudest troublemakers and malcontents came from Boston. After all, this was a town founded by Puritans hoping to get away from the wicked and ungodly practices of the king and people back in England. So it's not surprising at all to find a town full of people angry with how Parliament is micromanaging the colonies. And indeed, some of the earliest cries of taxation without representation, they came from Massachusetts. And let's not forget that the Sons of Liberty were active in Boston. It's also where Sam Adams agitated for more colonial unity. So, as Elvis Presley said, if you're looking for trouble, you've come to the right place. Boston, Massachusetts. Now, Boston, you will recall, was both the capital of Massachusetts and a major port city. As such, it housed the royal governor and assorted other administrative offices, the most important of which was the Customs House. In addition to handling immigration issues for folks coming into the colony or leaving it, this office also served as the colonial headquarters for all taxes and tariffs that were collected in the colony. So all import and export tariffs, like the ones involved in the Sugar Act or the Townshend duties, they got collected and brought to the Customs House before being sent back to Great Britain. Now, as you might expect, colonists did not exactly like the fact that there was a big building in the middle of the city that housed all of the revenue that had been collected through taxation without representation, and a big house filled with money might have been a tempting target for attack. And this is why British had soldiers stationed around the customs house at all hours of the day and night. And those soldiers were there on one frigid, cold night in March of 1770. And I'd like you to put yourself in the place of those soldiers right now, shivering, miserable, just praying that their shift would come and go without any trouble. But then they start to hear the rumbling of colonists on the street. See, those colonists, many of whom were members of the Sons of Liberty, had been meeting at local taverns, complaining about British rule, drinking, complaining, drinking, repeat. And when the taverns closed, these folks spilled out of the bars and into the streets, turning the corner to where the Customs House stood before them. Now, beloved students, I feel like I need to take this moment for a public service announcement about the dangers of alcohol consumption. In addition to being illegal for people under 21, alcohol, especially when consumed in excessive amounts, can have debilitating effects, impairing people both physically and mentally. In particular, it can lower people's natural inhibitions, causing them to say things and do things that they might not otherwise do if they were sober. So a sober person might look at a big bully and mutter something to himself under his breath. A drunk person, inhibitions lowered, might well say that thing out loud and directly at the big bully, which rarely ends well. It's a life lesson, kids. Don't drink. Well, when drunken Bostonians staggered up to the guards, armed guards, I'd like to remind you, standing in front of the customs house, did they quietly pass by and head home? No, they did not. Instead, they started attacking the soldiers, throwing trash and sticks at them. Some found old piles of snow to throw snowballs at the soldiers. And here's another life lesson that in an age of global warming, students in North Carolina might not know. Snowballs made from freshly fallen snow are light and fluffy. Snowball fights with these balls are delightful. But snow that's been lying around for a while starts to melt and then refreezes at night. Snowballs made from this material. They are not really snowballs, they are ice balls. And throwing blocks of ice at people can be dangerous, even life-threatening, especially when the targets have guns to defend themselves. So, two lessons here, kids. Don't drink and don't assault armed officers with ice balls. Faced with this dangerous barrage from drunken Bostonians, the soldiers, surrounded and fearing for their lives, fired their guns and tried to disperse the crowd. And when all was said and done, 5 colonists had been killed. Now, from what I've told you, it might make sense that what actually happened probably looked something like this. You see the soldiers, surrounded and threatening, firing in self-defense at the attacking Bostonians. But there are some times, rare times to be sure, when what actually happened is not as important as how it was portrayed in the media. And that's where things got interesting. Because the image that got sent around to the other colonies was not this one, the accurate one, it was this one. Created by a member of the Sons of Liberty, Paul Revere. Do you see the subtle difference between what actually happened and how Revere depicted it? In this image, the soldiers are standing in a line, led by a commander who orders them to fire into a crowd of helpless colonists, huddled masses yearning to breathe free. There's not a piece of wood or trash or ice ball in sight. This isn't self-defense, it's a massacre. And if there were any doubt about that, just look at what Revere called the event: the bloody massacre. And of course, there is a dog plaintively appealing to the soldiers not to kill its owner. See, in a very literal sense, this image paints a very different picture of what happened in Boston in March 1770. And that intentional distortion of the facts became the truth that colonists told each other, and that some folks will still tell today. But not me. I will always tell you the truth, even if it hurts. And you know what else hurts? Ice balls. Take my word for it. But before we move on, I want to stop here and make one important point. Because regardless of how or why violence occurred in Boston that night, the truth remains that the colonists were killed by British soldiers. That actually did happen. And that act of violence, even if it was justified, even if it was self-defense, that did fundamentally and permanently alter the relationship between the mother country and the colonists. A line had been crossed that couldn't be recrossed any more than those colonists could be unkilled. And so now violence, even deadly violence, at the hands of British soldiers was always a possibility from here on out. Of course, given what we learned about the Sons of Liberty tarring and feathering people, that violence could definitely go both ways, and indeed it would be 2 years later when the Gaspé incident in Rhode Island took place to prove that point. The Gaspé was a revenue ship used by the British government to collect and transport tax and tariff money. Not surprisingly, colonists did not like the Gaspé or any other such ship that came in to collect taxes. Remember, taxes being imposed without representation. And as it happened, the Gaspé had a particularly bad reputation for boarding ships and seizing contraband, whether or not there was any cause to do so. And on one day, the Gaspé was in Narragansett Bay, near Providence, Rhode Island, when it pursued a ship that the crew suspected of smuggling. But then the Gaspé ran aground in shallow water at low tide. Incapacitated, the Gaspé was just sitting there, helpless, and the crew would have to wait for high tide to free that vessel. But colonists, seeing the hated Gaspé sitting there helpless, they had other ideas. and a group of them rowed out to the Gaspé, forced the crew off the boat, and then burned it down to the water line. You see, violence can go both ways. And when the word got back to Parliament that colonists had destroyed one of their best revenue ships, they demanded an investigation. But the folks in Rhode Island were not in the mood to help with that investigation. So not only would colonists attack a ship, they'd also work to cover it up as well. So clearly there was something wrong with the relationship between the mother country and the colonies. But it was about to get worse. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act. Now, you'll remember that the Townshend duties had placed taxes on tea. 6 years later, they were back at it. But this time, instead of raising the tax on tea, Parliament lowered the tax. Wait, what? Lowered the tax? That doesn't sound right. That doesn't sound like the Parliament we know. What's going on here? You're right to be suspicious. Because while it is true that the tax on tea was reduced significantly with a plan to end it entirely, other parts of the Tea Act were not nearly so benign to the colonists. In truth, ever since the Townshend duties, colonists had been smuggling tea pretty brazenly, and so something needed to be done to crack down on these smugglers. By reducing the tea tax, it made it less profitable for smugglers to import their tea. But then Parliament did something else. It granted the East India Tea Company an exclusive contract to provide tea for the colonies. Now, why would it do that? Was it because the East India Tea Company was struggling financially and many members of Parliament had invested heavily in that company and stood to lose lots of money if that company failed? Well, yes, that's part of the story. But also, by granting one company, a British company, a monopoly on trade with the colonies, it could both prop up that company and it could also crack down on smuggling. Because now, if a tea shop in the colonies had tea that wasn't from the East India Tea Company, everyone would know that it had been smuggled, and people would start getting arrested. Oh, and one other thing. A lot of time, colonists made money serving as a sort of liaison between the tea importers and the merchants who ran the stores. But then, as part of the Tea Act, Parliament gave the tea importers, that is, the folks sailing the tea to the colonies, the right to negotiate directly with the tea merchants, cutting out an entire step in the process and putting lots of colonists out of work. Now you might think, doesn't lowering the tax on tea lower prices? And wouldn't cutting out a middleman lower prices even more? Why weren't colonists excited about this? Well, three reasons. As I mentioned above, lots of people lost their jobs when importers were able to negotiate directly with merchants. And second, monopolies don't usually lead to lower prices. Competition does that. So with no other teas legally available, the merchants could charge whatever they wanted, which was definitely going to be higher than they would have if there had been competition. And lastly, colonists resented having a choice taken away from them, like a parent making a choice for a child. Now, you might really like Cookout burgers, but if you were told that you could only ever have Cookout forever, you really might like that idea at first, especially if you like good milkshakes. But eventually, over time, you might get tired of it and irritated that you no longer have a choice. You might start longing for Char Grill or maybe even McDonald's. See, people like choice, and the Tea Act removed that choice without the colonists' consent. So how would they react to yet another injustice? Can you guess? That's right, with violence. A ship loaded down with tea from the East India Tea Company sailed into Boston Harbor in late 1773. If they were expecting a warm welcome, they were about to be disappointed. In fact, the folks working at the harbor, upset about the crackdown on smuggling, refused to let the ship land and offload its tea. Instead, it had to sit there in the harbor and wait, and wait. Bostonians told the ship to turn around and go back to England, and the sailors who had just finished a journey across the ocean that it had taken several weeks, they were not about to do that, at least not until they had offloaded the tea and gotten paid. But obviously that wasn't happening. And so the boat sat there in Boston Harbor. And if you remember what happened to the Gaspé, you know that waiting in a harbor can be dangerous. And indeed it was. Because on the night of December 16th, 1773, the Sons of Liberty attacked. Many were dressed up to look like Native Americans, but they went to the ship, boarded it, overpowered the crew, and then seized the crates of tea, smashing them open and then dumping them in to Boston Harbor. It was a shocking act of violence, and considering that they polluted the harbor in the process, you might call it an act of eco-terrorism. But when it was all done, about 340 crates of tea had been emptied into the harbor, which destroyed, in today's dollars, nearly $2 million worth of tea. That's not a party. And so, considering how much was destroyed and how much was lost in one night of mob violence, maybe it is strange that we still call this thing a tea party. And what might be even stranger is that if you go to Boston Harbor today, there's a tourist attraction that lets you reenact the Boston Tea Party. You pay your admission fee, and then they hand you a big styrofoam crate, and then you can make some kind of speech about taxation without representation or governmental overreach, and then hurl the crate into the harbor. Then they scoop up the crate and hand it to the next tourist, who shelled out $34 in order to reenact a eco-terroristic photo opportunity. But in the wake of the Boston Tea Party, how would Parliament react to this incredible act of violence and destruction? With the Coercive Acts. As the name indicates, Parliament was not playing around anymore, and they passed a series of draconian measures designed to punish Boston and the Massachusetts colony and to coerce the other colonies into better behavior. Of course, some know-it-all parent might look at the Coercive Acts and say, none of this would have been necessary if you hadn't given that kid that lollipop back in 1765 and 66. But be that as it may, the Coercive Acts had several important elements. First, Parliament immediately shut down the port in Boston Harbor and said that it wouldn't get reopened until Boston repaid all of the cost of the tea that had been destroyed. And that makes sense, of course. But it's also problematic because the only way to get the port reopened was to pay for the tea, but the only way for Boston to get the money to pay for the tea was to reopen Boston Harbor. And if you've never heard of it before, this is what we call a catch-22, or a no-win situation. But the acts did more than that. They also temporarily shut down Massachusetts's colonial legislature, and they limited the ability of town meetings to take place across the colony. In addition, the acts determined that Massachusetts couldn't be trusted to hold fair trials anymore, and so it moved most major criminal trials out of the colony and all the way back to Great Britain. And finally, and perhaps most alarmingly, Parliament made good on the Quartering Act it had passed nearly 10 years earlier, declaring martial law in Massachusetts and sending troops to occupy Boston. In many cases, they were housing those troops in the private homes of citizens. Are you starting to get the impression that Parliament was serious about sending a message to the colonies? But wait, there's one more thing, and it wasn't officially part of the Coercive Acts, but it did still send a similar message to colonists. The Quebec Act. You might remember that at the end of the 7 Years' War, Great Britain got control of all of French Canada, and considering that the British and the French hated each other, you can imagine that the French Canadians, some of whom were called Acadians, resisted British rule. And many of the most outspoken had been deported after the war, and eventually they made their way down to Louisiana, where they blended with the Spanish and indigenous cultures, and thus the Acadians became known as Cajuns. But for those who remained in Quebec, they were placed under really, really strict rule, far more strict than the colonies had known. But the rest of the land out west, well, that was pretty free. And so some colonists thought, it might be nice to just head out west there and be free. But what the Quebec Act did is slam the door shut on that idea by taking the strictly run province of Quebec that you see here in this red blob and extending its borders to pretty much include all of the Western Territory. And this sent another message to the colonists. Don't expect that you can escape strict British rule by going out west. Don't even try it. So, how then did colonists react to all of these new restrictive acts? Not well. Indeed, it says a lot that the colonists refused to call the coercive acts by their actual name. Instead, they called them the intolerable acts, as in not to be tolerated. Okay, but what did that mean? Well, it meant that colonial leaders needed to spring into action. Colonists knew that they needed to work together to resist the intolerable acts, and that meant getting the band back together again and having delegates from the colonies meet in real life. And thus was born the First Continental Congress, which met in 1774. Of course, they didn't call it the First Continental Congress because they had no idea that there would be a second one, in kind of the same way that World War I was called the Great War right up until the moment when World War II broke out. But here's what they decided. First, delegates wanted to go on the record that they were condemning the intolerable acts. Now, condemning something has no actual force or effect, but it certainly sends a message. And the delegates weren't done. They declared a general boycott on importing all British products, and that meant that Britain couldn't just dump products in colonial markets anymore. More threatening, the Congress promised that it might stop exporting all of those precious American cash crops to Great Britain if the intolerable acts weren't repealed. And then Congress made one last charge. And that last charge was based upon the belief that taxation without representation is tyranny. And so, thus, Congress declared that only the state legislatures actually had the power and authority because they provided direct representation, so only they had the authority to levy taxes. And so colonial legislatures, they could tax the people, but Parliament had no authority to tax the colony at all for anything. And if that sounds like a bold claim, that's because it is. Our 5-year-olds have certainly grown up, and they're now feisty 16-year-olds, responding as if a parent had said, "Clean your room," and the response was, "You can't make me." Now, I hope you have a better relationship with your parents than colonists did in 1774 with theirs. But because when the First Continental Congress said, "You can't make me," Parliament responded in the only way a parent can respond when their authority has just been challenged. And the response is, "Oh, yes, I can. Just watch me." And perhaps knowing that Parliament was about to respond to the First Continental Congress with violence, the colonists began to prepare. First, many joined something called the Continental Association, which was essentially a social club designed to encourage colonists, sometimes gently, sometimes not so gently, to maintain the embargo against importing British products. The logic was, in the words of Benjamin Franklin, we must hang together or we shall assuredly hang separately. But embargoes are one thing. They don't protect citizens against troops. For that, you need the Minutemen. That's why communities started assembling militias, citizen armies that could be ready at a minute's notice, hence the name, to gather to protect their fellow colonists against any aggressive moves by the British military. No one would ever accuse the Minutemen of looking or acting like a real army, but it was better than nothing. And hey, maybe the British troops wouldn't attack. Okay, here's where we get to the part of the story that you might remember, although you might not remember it exactly as it happened. In April of 1775, Boston was occupied, its port closed, and martial law declared. The royal governor had been replaced by a military governor named Thomas Gage. And given the dangerous conditions, rebel leaders like Sam Adams and John Hancock had found that it was too dangerous to stay in Boston, and so they decamped to the nearby town of Lexington. Meanwhile, a cache of arms had been collected one town over in a place called Concord. General Gage would probably have been happy to stay in Boston, but he got orders that he needed to go out and capture the leaders, presently in Lexington, and then capture the weapons arsenal that was in Concord. And that's precisely what he planned to do. in the evening of April 18th, 1775. Meanwhile, American spies in Boston had been tracking Gage's movements to determine both when he would send troops out and by which route he would send the troops out. And that would let rebel leaders know exactly how much time they had to warn the leaders in Lexington to leave town, and how much time they would have to assemble the Minutemen to resist the approaching British army. So if you look carefully at the map here, you can see that Boston was on a peninsula, essentially looking like a frying pan. If the troops went by land, that is, marching off the peninsula and then all the way around to meet up on the road to Lexington, it would take far longer to do than if they went by sea, crossing the Charles River and heading directly to the Lexington Road. And so if you've ever heard that Henry Wadsworth Longfellow poem called The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere, you might recall the line about hanging lanterns in the belfry of the Old North Church. One if by land, and two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be ready to ride and spread the alarm to every Middlesex village and farm. Well, now you know why it mattered whether it was one lamp or two lamps. And as it happened, it was two, because General Gage's troops decided to go by sea. Now, we don't have enough time to discuss all of the factual errors in that poem, but suffice it to say, don't get your history from poems. Indeed, Longfellow makes it seem like Revere was the lone voice crying in the wilderness, a hero who single-handedly saved the independence movement by riding through the night on a wholly patriotic mission. Well, what is true is that Revere did go from town to town, alerting Minutemen that British troops were on the move. What isn't true is that he did it alone. He had a partner, Charles Dawes, and the two of them did a fair job of raising the alarm. They got to Lexington, warned Hancock and Adams to leave town, but then they got caught, shouting out in the middle of the night, we'll let that happen, and they never made it to Concord. Luckily, another member of the team, Samuel Prescott, happened by the scene, and he realized that someone needed to get the word to Concord, and he carried the message the rest of the way. But regardless of how it happened, by the time the next morning rolled around, British troops had made it to Lexington Green, the town square, and so too had a ragtag band of Massachusetts militiamen ready to stop them. And that brings us to the battles of Lexington and Concord. Now, historians will usually declare April 19, 1775 as the day when the American Revolution began, not because it was the first episode of violence or because it caused the Declaration of Independence immediately. Neither of those things were true. This date matters because it's when the battles of Lexington and Concord happened, which is when two groups of armed soldiers faced off against each other in a legitimate military engagement, or at least something that looked a little bit like a legitimate military engagement. So if you've been waiting for a date to memorize, go ahead and memorize April 19, 1775. And now, when I describe these two sides as armies, I'm using some poetic license here. This wasn't exactly D-Day. On the British side, there were about 700 soldiers from the regular army. They were well trained, well armed, well dressed, in their bright red coats with a big white X across the chest, essentially saying, "Shoot me here." On the colonist side, there were a mere 75 militiamen, poorly trained, poorly armed, with nothing more than their hunting muskets. No uniforms and no real idea about what was about to happen. And the skirmish that took place at Lexington Green lasted only a couple of minutes before the colonists, being vastly outnumbered, retreated all the way to Concord. But just for fun, let's look at how many people got killed in the first battle of the Revolution. The British, 700 strong, firing at just 75 Americans, managed to kill 8 and wound 10. Not bad. But look at the American side, 75 militiamen staring into a sea of 700 redcoats. It's like they couldn't miss. And yet all of them somehow missed. Well, all except for one person. And you have to feel bad for that one British soldier. I mean, what bad luck to be the only person hit by an American bullet. Well, in truth, the Battle of Concord wasn't much longer or more consequential than Lexington had been. A few folks got killed on both sides, but the bigger story was that the British were not able to capture the colonists' stash of weapons, and they had to head back to Boston, having captured neither the leaders nor the weapons. And yet something had changed. The dispute between the mother country and her colonies wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was an armed rebellion. Well, a quick postscript here. The road back to from Lexington and Concord proved to be far more deadly than the two actual battles, because as the troops retreated, colonists started taking pot shots at the army, which led the army to return fire. And as the map showed, this happened several times along the long and bloody afternoon as they tried to travel back to Boston. And by the end of the day, both sides had lost a pretty significant number of people overall. And that served as something of a wake-up call to both sides. The British realized that they needed to be more aggressive, and the Americans realized that they needed more men, more weapons, more training, and more of everything. And this would be proven to be true, all too true, in June of 1775 when the British, back in Boston, realized that it was dangerous to allow Americans to continue to occupy the high ground overlooking the city, two hills called Breed's Hill and Bunker Hill. The Americans' puny muskets couldn't do any real damage from that point, but what if the Americans had somehow gotten, I don't know, cannon? Well, then the British occupation of Boston would be threatened. And so, to forestall that, British troops crossed the river and then fought to push the Americans off of Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. And the fight was brutal. And the British lost a whopping 1,000 troops during the course of this battle. But they did prevail. But having lost such a huge percentage of their own troops, it really didn't feel that much like a victory to the British. Now, political leaders, having just barely escaped Lexington, they knew that the colonies needed to work together if the colonists had any chance of standing up to the vastly superior British army. And so the call went out for another Continental Congress, this time to meet in Philadelphia in 1775, and once convened, the group got right down to work. The first thing that they did was to decide that they would stay in session until the situation was resolved, one way or the other. And spoiler alert, this explains why when independence was declared a year later, it wasn't the Third Continental Congress, it was still this second one. And next, the group put together two petitions. The first one was directed at Parliament, in which the colonists attempted to explain the causes and necessity of taking up arms in a document creatively titled The Declaration of the Causes and Necessity of Taking Up Arms. And essentially they said, you sent your troops to occupy our territory. We're just fighting in self-defense. But then the Congress sent a second petition, this one to the king, called the Olive Branch Petition, symbol of peace. The letter asked the king to protect the colonists from mean old Parliament. And this was a classic play one parent against the other scenario, but it was destined to fail because, as you probably remember, the king was a figurehead and had no actual power to do anything at all. So the last and perhaps most consequential thing that the Second Continental Congress did was to realize that it wasn't just enough to call on militias to fight against a fully functioning British army. The colonists needed an army of their own, a real army, and so Congress created one. And an army needed a commander-in-chief, and so they looked around for someone qualified to lead the army. And when they couldn't find anyone qualified, they named this guy you see here, George Washington. Really? The guy who had been captured out in the Ohio country in 1754? Yeah, that guy. See, now truly history had its eyes on him, and luckily, Washington was dressed for the part, with smart new uniform like this. How would he do? Well, that is for another presentation. But let me draw your attention to one last thing. You notice the seal of the United States Army? Isn't it curious that the Army's starting date, its founding date was 1775, a full year before there was a United States of America to defend? I thought that was interesting too. Well, this Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia, sent a couple of petitions to the British government, put George Washington in command of the army, and then what? Well, it wasn't done yet. Right? Over the next year, they would start to wonder about whether resisting British tyranny was enough. I mean, what was the end goal? Was it just getting the troops to leave, or maybe, just maybe getting Great Britain out of the colonies altogether? You know, permanently. And so the drive toward independence was inspired by Enlightenment ideologies of John Locke, who favored a government that was focused on protecting the rights of its citizens, and Rousseau, who believed that the best government was a social contract between the government and the governed. And of course, Montesquieu, who believed that governments should be virtuous and that the best way to accomplish this was to make sure no one person or entity ever got to be too powerful. Couple these Enlightenment ideas with the beliefs of the Great Awakening that stressed the ability of the individual to shape his own destiny, and you can see how the resistance movement was quickly turning into an independence movement. But if the Second Continental Congress was on the brink of declaring independence, it was definitely Thomas Paine who pushed them over the edge with his pamphlet Common Sense, in which he explained that the only logical thing to do was for the colonists to declare independence. And here's why. If we can agree that governments that fail to protect the rights of their citizens should be altered or abolished, and if we can also agree that due to everything that has happened along this road to revolution, that Britain was failing to protect the natural rights of its citizens, then by a simple mathematical substitution, we can see that the only logical, common sense response would be that the British government should be abolished in the colonies. And that meant that the colonies should be once and forever free. And to do that, that meant that the colonies needed to go ahead and declare independence. And that, my friends, is the push that Congress needed. In the summer of 1776, the Second Continental Congress asked Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin to draft a Declaration of Independence. The final document, which lifted a lot of philosophical justification for independence from the writings of John Locke, declared that all men are created equal. Sorry, ladies. And that because Britain couldn't or wouldn't recognize the equality of Englishmen living in America, the only thing to do was to declare independence. And that's just what they did. Now, we'll spend a bit more time on the Declaration in a future presentation, but now that we have made it all the way down our road to revolution and our 5-year-olds have crossed the stage as fully formed adults, it's time for this presentation to end. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the other side of the screen.